So it starts with drugs are eccentric, meaning in the Hölderlinian sense already, what is outside, moves outside of the center, can't center it. They're animated by an outside already inside. Endorphins relate internal secretion to the external chemical. That's not where I want to go, but already, again, if we could have hours and weeks to consider this, you know, when you endorphinate, as when we're in class, especially yesterday, what is this? This kind of, or serotonin, or these drugs that we have that get us high, that don't necessarily rely on the external prosthetic chemical. Okay, this is a question. Where do you locate, and how do you deconstruct inside and outside? Where do you locate the effect of a high when you have something like endorphins? You all know what endorphins are, I hope, for your sake. Which don't depend on an injection, an ingestion, or anything of the sort. So, but this is where I wanted to go. Drugs are eccentric and deprocreative. In hashish in Marseille, Benjamin. Okay, so hashish in Marseille is Walter, has anyone read it?
Yeah. Yes.
Good. It's Walter Benjamin's experiment with hash. Again, if we had time, bless you, we would try to understand why it would be in Marseille, why he goes to France, why he reroutes or has a GPS that takes him to France in order to try drugs. And that topos of going south in order to get high. This is something that could take us through Thomas Mann and all sorts of literary precedents for us. In other words, these kinds of experiments, except if you're wiring up the Frankenstein monster, tend to take place in more southern regions that are falsely or phantasmatically hooked up to libidinal openness in certain ways. But why does Benjamin have to hoof it to Marseille in order to make this experiment happen? So, citing his, notice the quotation marks, his so-called experience with hash, he borrows from Baudelaire his opening. So here's what this moment tries to articulate. Can we have our own most experience, not only of anything, of course, but of drugs? Is there a way of writing up a journal of that experience? And in larger seminars, I try to track those works that really make an effort to describe or reconfigure what has happened. But look at how it happens with Benjamin and almost everyone, by the way. So Benjamin is going to show what his experience, if we had time, we would also consider the word experience, which has peri in it, which means risk or danger. Last night Anne talked about risk and risking one's life. It is not even clear that we can have an experience. By the way, the experienceability of experience was deconstructed by Benjamin himself. He says we're so shocked, or we need, in order to have anything like an experience, a kind of Schockerlebnis, a shock. We're just very far away from the possibility of experiencing experience. So when we talk about drugs or wanting to have this experience, are we there to experience it? What constitutes experience? What are the conditions for the possibility of any experience? And so on and so forth. So he wants to tell us about his experience. But what does it mean when a text, in order to tell about itself and its own most experience of something, which would be radically singular, what is more singular than your trips or your highs or your crashes? Maybe they're not singular. Maybe everyone crashes in the same way. I don't think that's what you think is happening. I think you each have an idiomatic relation to freaking up, being fucked up, and so on and so forth. But here, Benjamin has been resolute in his desire to experiment on himself. We can't get into, or maybe we will get into, the relation between taking drugs and experimentation and what Nietzsche calls our experimental disposition. Like, what are you doing taking drugs, guys? Okay, I'm neither for nor against, by the way. So preliminary remark, one of the first signs, this is Benjamin, that hashish is beginning to take effect, quote, is a dull feeling of foreboding. Something strange, ineluctable is approaching. The subject is surprised and overwhelmed. His laughter, and if we have time we should jam on laughter and drugs. All his utterances happen to him like outward events. End of quote. So here's what I found astonishing, and I kept on finding it happening in the archives of drug-induced writing, which is at the very moment, and this may be generalizable, otherwise I wouldn't be that interested in it. This may be what writing is. There's a politics of quotation, of citationality, of injecting Baudelaire into his textual body. You notice how Benjamin, who by the way wrote, among other things, on the Trauerspiel, the Baroque mourning play, in which he told us how important allegory is. This may be an allegory for all writing and our body relation to writing. By the way, what is your relation to text? Do you smoke it? Do you eat it? Do you shoot it up? Do you drop it? You drop it a lot. But, do you hallucinate what's going on? Do you have a dependency on your texts? In Madame Bovary, where we have the first addicted body, I claim, she devours her texts. She eats them up. She can't, and she's anorexic. So here we have something where Benjamin is going to tell us an authentic, non-generalizable experience. It happened to him alone. He's the sole experimenter on his own body. And yet, at the moment where he starts saying, remember when Clinton said it depends what is? The moment that he's about to say is, what it is. Tell us what it is, Walter. It's a quotation mark, or what Kittler and Larry have shown to be marks of the vampire. He's introducing the foreign body. It's called Baudelaire. This is Baudelaire's description of his experience, which itself is part of a politics of quotation. So what happens to me, I mean, I'm translating now. What happens to me when I get high? Let me quote De Quincey or Baudelaire or Benjamin to you. So when De Quincey takes opium and he wants to explain what's going on in the journal, The Confessions of an Opium Eater, he suddenly opens up his text, and what do you see? Wordsworth. So they're on each other. There's a very interesting is a bad word, there's a very compelling way in which at once there's an ejection. This is the foreign body that we were talking about, right? Is this other text or the text of the other, or the experience that is never only mine, as Heidegger would say? It's not Jemeinigkeit, but it's already expropriated, it's already part of an experience of the other who is maybe my dealer, maybe injecting me against my will, or with my complicity and consensus. So Benjamin takes an injection of a foreign body, Baudelaire's text, Les Paradis Artificiels, in order to express his inner experience. You see, this is what's so perverse and impossible about this. Benjamin sets out to tell us about his innermost experience. So innermost turns out to be signed by Baudelaire.
But what's interesting about Benjamin is that if we were to identify his addiction in books, it is quotations. So that what he is trying to describe, the drug experience, he falls back on his own addiction to the one thing.
That's lovely, lovely. Bravo. So you have the same initials, right? Well, inverted.
Inverted.
Yeah. So as I'm dyslexic, that's what this place does to me. So you're absolutely right. So what this is an allegory of, and I wish you had been at my side when I wrote this, is Benjamin's true addiction, to say it in shorthand, which is the Benjamin's wish was always articulated as wanting to quote everyone, to stuff everyone in there and in his textual body. And this would be an allegory of the addiction, which is the incorporation of the text of the other. Benjamin was a collector of books and devoured quotes. Thank you so much. That's a beauty.
In particular, books by the insane.
Say more.
No, I was just going to say that this particular piece, Hashish Naseh, is the polished article version or outcome of a series of experimental protocols
Exactly.
he conducted, where he was trying to construct for his own experience or research an approximation to psychosis. And so I'm reminded of the books by the insane, his close relationship to Schreiber. So drugs are being used as a research, writing, crossing over instrument to gain access to the alternate realities of psychosis here.
And do you know why he wanted that access? Or?
That's not entirely clear. But I'm going to, yeah, do you have the answer?
I don't have any answers, only questions. But who's writing books that isn't insane? I mean, let's be real here.
No, it's true. He
No,
he ends that essay by clearly talking about his own origin.
Well, and he was dear friends with Georges Bataille, who, in Sir Nietzsche, on Nietzsche says, what forces me to write is the fear of going mad.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right.
Thanks, Mark.
So there are several things one could say about it. One could say that it's also a form of defense against his having to identify himself too quickly as the author of a mad book. It's an experimental protocol, after all. It's something that doesn't risk dependency, that always issues in written accounts of the event.
This is done under the banner of scientific research on himself. That's very true, and that though very often all relations to drugs, so-called recreational drugs, begin as an experimental effort toward the possibility of an ever-altering mind. It's mind-altering. My question is very often about states of consciousness, presence, non-presence, and so on and so forth. And part of this work asks, together with Derrida, what do we hold against the drug addict? Like, what is it that allows the delirious, mad war on drugs? Are drugs something that can be waged war on? In the next, one of the next books, Stupidity, I say you can't even wage war on stupidity. Even the gods cannot combat stupidity, says Schiller. Let's just finish this hit. To locate his almost subjectivity, Thomas de Quincey cited Wordsworth, as I just said. These texts are on each other, a textual communication based on tropium. So these texts are smoking each other, dependent on each other, reliant on each other, and make each other somehow produce what I call elsewhere a hallucino-genre. So there's something that is taking place, and also in terms of a competition with fiction itself and poetic utterance that is either heightened or drained off by a relation to drug. The question is there the possibility of not having a relation to dependency, to drugs, and so on and so forth? Is there anything, I mean, if you also insert the certain types of drugs into the whole range of experience, or the experienceability of experience, you will also go to the sacred in Latin America in particular. There's always a relation, not always, but often a relation to the sacred, to the and so on and so forth. I want to cut this short because I think Jamie said something very interesting in the break. Do you feel like bringing it up again about what was about technology? Because I do treat drugs as a technology. Okay.
The direction I was heading is more probably just to relate to parasitic. What someone said about the sort of spectrum of parasites having kind of different kinds of morality, even like how they're collaborating with you, and I was thinking about food in relationship to drugs, as maybe like a diabetic would know the mood changes that you go through at different sugar levels in your blood, and how you kind of differentiate between those as technologies or as sustaining forces. I'm not sure.
Okay, and then you were talking about what Larry was doing yesterday. That remember?
Yeah, which I think has to do with how much of that you accept or you do not about yourself. So whether or not the projections you were talking about yesterday into technologies tend to be reactions to that fact. So whether or not the psychosis that evolves from, I don't know, trying to deny our connection to physical dirtiness like that. But that was not a form of thought.
Yeah.
I mean, one way to begin to address that would be to remember Freud's definition of intoxicants, or all attempts to become intoxicated, which was that it was the search for the ultimate libido toxin. He calls it a toxin. The ultimate libido toxin that informs the sexual arousal and love, and yet is more than that. A definition that reminds me of many descriptions of vampirism as like sex, but more than sex. And that more than is interesting because there is at the same time something about intoxication that can, I suppose it doesn't have to, but can defunctionalize not necessarily one's sexuality, but the sexuality that is genitally centered. which is the body that we bring into the zone of tensions when it comes to socialization and sexual relation. So, for example, when we stood upright, it wasn't only that we lost the whiff of the other, but we also exposed ourselves to one another, pornographically, as it were, as genitally centered bodies. And it was out of that revelation that we had to control sexualities as women. We had to invent the family. We had to invent marriage. We had to control, release sexuality because of this overstimulation. And the drug then would be looking for that more than pleasure, which is perhaps also prior to the struggle to socialize sexuality via these various control releases, family, the couple.
The more than pleasure is what also motivated some of the considerations and reflections of this work. There's many registers. I usually try, like Ben-Hur, to control about 6 horses as I ride my chariot. I write my chariot, you know. There's several layers and registers, and one better not trip up the other. It's not very easy in that little cockpit of mine to write. But the more than pleasure, for example, this is something that really stoked my interest, which is, Alex, I need you here. Which is what is, and I use we in the most unrigorous way, why are we attracted to drug culture or inscribed in drug culture? What is it? In order for it to be something that calls out to you, there has to be some sort of supplement of pleasure. I need your presence here too. Thanks. I mean, what do you guys think you're doing? You know, I'm an exhausted body, and if you're gonna Facebook or whatever, it's just breaking a covenant. This is a sacred time that we have together. But if you don't want it, I would be very happy to take a nap right now. You know? So this exhausted body still wants to teach you, but you don't have to. I mean, it's up to you. You know, I don't have an avidity to teach. I'd rather write. So where was I? The pleasure. If the relation to drugs, including addictions to your technologies, are kind of grounded in pleasure, is that what calls it forth? That's something I wanted to really attend to and understand. What Larry just said was very important. The more than pleasure that Freud also situates as, in his title, beyond the pleasure principle. Beyond the pleasure principle. In other words, if we're driven by pleasure, we never just stop and park at pleasure, but we move beyond the pleasure, or are moved beyond the pleasure principle to that space which is here scandalously shorthanded as the death drive. What drives us is the death drive. It's not, oh, how sweet, or I'm entertained, or this is easy listening, or something like that. It's something that that I call and try to analyze in terms of a destructive jouissance. The destructive jouissance is that which really amps up the velocities of our movement toward something, what Heidegger calls the being toward death. This is a movement. This is what Nietzsche would call a disposition. This being toward death is what we are. toward or beyond are moments that we would love to understand, unfold, be attentive to. So beyond the pleasure principle for Freud is the death drive, is what actually motors us. And it's toward destruction. And we have this in our most basic, ordinary vocabularies, as we said, some of us recently, which is what are the nuclear vocabularies to express and mark and tag great pleasure, which is to say when we are beyond the pleasure principle. It would be something like we're having a blast, as we are right now. And
Blown away.
blown away, thank you. I'm blown away. It means I'm decimated, I'm staggered, which means that something will have hit you and threatened you with extinction. Earlier, Larry opened by explaining different modalities of the fear of annihilation and so on. It's not only a fear, but where there is fear, there's also the thrill factor. Not only the fear factor, but the thrill factor. And there's something that almost, this may be wrong and sacrilegious, on an instinctual level, that pushes and motivates beyond the pleasure principle. And that's something that I wanted to understand with drugs, because also the relation to law, because the law is that which tries to, of course, keep you on this side of pleasure, believe it or not. But that would be opening up other dossiers. Yes?
Could I add to that
Yes,
first?
please.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying about the destructiveness as a primal setting for this more than. You talked about the gift and in the very beginning, and it's being relieved of the orbit of exchange and so on. And yet for psychoanalysis, also for Winnicott, but certainly for Freud, the gift has to be received. And then a gift that is not received becomes first traumatic. But that first gift, according to Freud, is of course one's bowel movement. And when that is not received, when it turns into gift, into poison.
When it's flush.
Exactly. The child who has an all or nothing relationship to such an exchange will immediately wish the non-receiving other gone. And this first form of what Freud calls the death wish is also at the same time and inevitably the first flexing of what he calls omnipotence of thought. And this omnipotence, the omnipotence of the baby as body genital, as group of one, that's as pre and beyond, more than all the couplifications and socializations that will befall him or her subsequently. That, I think, is, at least for Freud, what we're thrown back upon through the more than pleasure that drugs administer.
And
So it's close to the death wish as the,
wishing the other gone.
yeah.
That would be very exciting to now open the file on a double issue of drugs, which I aborded or entered much too quickly, and then we'll hear from you, Nick, which is the way drugs are isolating or how they establish community, a community of those who are somehow together or with non-presence in a way. And I mean drugs in the largest possible sense, not starting, but with Dionysian frenzy, okay, that Nietzsche bases the birth of tragedy on. Anything that refigures or configures individuality or collectivity, that brings you together with the other and absolutely keeps you apart from others. So this would be a file that I would want to look into in the way that Larry was suggesting. I'm interested in hearing more about it. We were talking about when the Wolfman knocks on Freud's door. I think it's Wolfman, not Ratman, and he says, or he offers in session to shit on Freud's head. Freud very calmly and elegantly says, this was a great compliment, because to make caca on my head means he wanted to make a gift for me, or give me an offering. So, yeah, that's Wolfman. So Freud realized that Wolfman, but don't get any ideas, as we said, his offering to shit on his head is one of the greatest compliments and most primal scenes, the most, of giving what you've produced to the other. And you know how, you may not know, but the little ones are very proud of having produced their first caca, and they offer it, and that's what you're saying. If it should get rejected, that or its metaphoric offshoots, then something starts, and the non-reception, or the sense that this is dirty and rejectable, is the moment of a traumatic disconnection. Right? Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, because this, the debate and this kind of introspection on how drugs fall into communities and how they build communities and everything, in many, I'd say, I mean, as far as I know, American places, it's very articulated. No, this is the initial discourse to invite you in the culture, to separate, or rather to include or integrate drugs and do not have it as a separate being of a community. The whole kind of process into it, with the Huichol Indians in the mountains of Jalisco, for example, with peyote, or ayahuasca in Peru, or the Amazon, or even coca. No, I mean,
it's
the
part of a thinking of hospitality.
Exactly, it's part of the thing, but they make sure that you get this they transmit this kind of shifting, knowing it's like you separate things. No, you have a more, let's say, let's call it a much more psychoanalytical approach, perhaps, of the pleasure and the experience of going around. But what you experience is also this kind of integration. But all of a sudden,
or the simulation of integration, because if we were integrated, would we have to get high together? You know.
But I mean the integration of the subject drugs into the.
Right. It's very, or smoking. It could be more about smoking a peace pipe, kind of moment of saying this. I remember, for example, maybe this is too free associative, when Larry and I surprise visited Friedrich Hitler once in California. We just drove over, and he was so happy to see us. Do you remember? But he looked alarmed, so I thought maybe he wasn't happy to see us. But I said, "Why are you so alarmed? Just because we invaded you?" And he said, "No, because I have no drugs to offer you." And so for him, it would have. He failed, he thought, in offering hospitality. So I see what you mean, but that doesn't mean that, and there are many typologies, and this is a complex thing. This is why I wanted to open it. There weren't theoretical considerations of what bus heist drugs before. It was just considered okay to beat the crap out of bodies of color because of some, let's say, untheorized mappings. So I wanted to ask and show the rich relationships to drugs, but I couldn't afford, in my, let's say, warrior pose, to include, because that would have defeated and collapsed or turned against the text, to show what Latin American
The
habits, yeah, because that would prove their point. You know, I was just, look how white culture is totally drug dependent.
Oh yes, no. When I mean you, I mean us as subjects. I mean,
Right, okay.
coming into that world. But just to, I mean, the absolute that they make is in the Huichol Indian when you're about doing peyote, and
Yeah.
this is they mention it first and foremost. This is a plant that that makes you communicate with God.
Yeah,
So they cover the whole
the whole spectrum.
the whole spectrum.
And these are telecommunication technologies, drugs, because you are establishing maybe a transcendental or an other switchboard or the switchboard of the other as well. So thank you, that's excellent. Anders, did you want to say
No,
something?
I
And
was
then
just thinking about
Alex.
exactly the idea of breaking the limits of the entity, the body entity, and so forth. Both in hallucination, but also in this case in sharing drugs, sharing the peace pipe and so forth. And I was reading Appropriation by Pollution by Michel Serres, and where he talks exactly about this how for example, your spit and so forth makes you appropriate a territory. But in sharing that, I mean, the idea of peace pipe is exactly you share it. So you also mark a common territory where you can coexist, and I think yeah.
Or we're up close with the impossibility of sharing, sharing the unshareable. What is being shared, or is it again a fiction of sharing? I mean, this is where I would want to push against. Yes, it seems like let's have a joint, let's do this, meaning we're peaceful, we're disarmed, we're even allowing, we don't have to be, you know, the person on alert is on a military alert, person who can't afford. And Kant says certain people in civic society cannot afford to get high. They're too low to get high. And so this would be, for Kant, Jews, clergymen, and women. They cannot run around drunk, staggering, out of it. They can't afford it. They'll get the crap beaten out of them. They have to be sober, on alert, and self-protective. So Kant says not everyone has the privilege of getting high and mind-altering in a way that shows what you're suggesting also, vulnerability. If I get high with you, don't count on it, then I'm also making myself susceptible, disarming myself, the defenses go out the window. Am I right here, or am I wrong? I don't know. But it's at least in terms of the syntax of let's get high, let's drop acid, let's do this, let's take X, meaning that I'm exposing myself to the suspension of a certain civic or civilized limit of relationality, right? That certain...
That's not something to lose.
Yes.
Okay, Gaiman, I think, would be part of that as well.
Right. Kant was not saying, you know, fags and dykes and all this and that, you know, should be careful either. He was saying there are those people in 18th century Europe, you're absolutely right, though recovery is a big issue in gay communities, who just can't afford it. So the luxury of mind-altering behaviors, which, by the way, I use drugs like training wheels. Because then philosophically, phenomenologically, and psychoanalytically, I try to get rid of the drugs and flush them and just think about consciousness and what isn't mind-altering. Think about internal alterity. Alterity, we discussed, some of us yesterday, which is difference and otherness and just splitting, dividing, multiplying selves that are in contradiction and so on and so forth. You don't have to drop acid to have, or you can be Schraber or have lots of voices inhabiting you and lots of mind. All that may be the relation to being, as a matter of fact. Yes.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it seems like you're resisting a certain kind of incorporation or a sort of being togetherness without distinction, without honoring each individual. In the response, at least in this work, there's a movement away from it for the intention of craft forms. I was just wondering, if I'm reading that correctly, is there what's torquing that then? What's resisting that? You know, like the example that we had of peyote, or anything else. I don't know. I think I can't quite.
Oh, well, thank you. So it's very helpful for all of you when you write or do your artwork or your performances, and to ask or hear, where does it resist? That's extremely important. And that's what I've just been asked or told, that there's a resistance in this book that you're trying to locate and pinpoint. But that is an extremely important question. Where does it resist in itself? That could be your decisive move on a text when you move in for a relationship, some duration on a text, or when you're inhabited by it, or when you find that there's things that every text has blind spots. And actually the blind spots are very often the richest places. You shouldn't go into phobic flight when you find them. You should try to invite them and grapple with them. So you're saying that I resist, or the person who wrote this resisted the more gentle, interpretive stance toward peyote or drugs, peyote being a sign of a certain community building syntax. Is that what you're saying? That I seem to...
Well, I mean, and it seems sort of like Levinasian in the sense that it's preserving difference, like actual difference. And it seems like that's what you're, if I'm reading correctly, in this work, and the author of this work is resisting a sort of losing of identity or blurring of boundaries, or a certain sort of metaphysics of subjectivity.
That's interesting. I don't have much access to the author anymore, and you know, this is, I don't know whether Larry has even the simulacrum of self-presence when, as many of you who look at your work, it's very alien and shocking and surprising, and I'm interested by what you're saying.
I guess, and if I can add to that, in your reading of other readers reading this work, there's, and sort of some of the declarations that you've made on behalf of that author, it seems like you're preferring a certain kind of direction based on your articulation that this is really sort of a certain resistance to representation. You're returning to the image that seems like the incept of maybe for this work of one of them, of a black body being beaten. And you've given other images also.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm just trying to piece together, is it for this reason that there's a necessary resistance to a certain kind of reading which maybe doesn't honor or
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for the work and rigor of having read the book, which one can't take for granted here, and for the questioning that you placed before us. I had to really be very careful not to fall in, and I'm not even sure if I can talk for the author, whom I've lost contact with. She went on one final drug trip, I think. Yeah. I had to resist idealizing or offering anything that could be seized upon as a counterexample that would exempt me. I was trying to, very often, she, I think, was trying to establish a table of negotiation around which one could negotiate. Because before this really, and after this, addiction studies emerged. But before this, this wasn't considered a proper object of contemplation, certainly not of academic elaboration. Who the fuck writes about drugs? Unless they're a big junkie or something. Okay, if you're William Burroughs, great. But to take it seriously as if it were a phenomenological and ethical task, you know, first of all, that was outrageous. I had to be sure not to go into certain districts and neighborhoods where I would just be picked off or picked out or hauled off by some policing of the university readership, to the extent that they read at all, as some hippie, dippy, out of it, Berkeley, don't forget it's Berkeley too, berserkly kind of cool chick who wants to, you know, or that I'm fishing around for cool topics. I have to be very careful to run a tight ship here, and also to keep my eyes on the prize, and keep it focused on the history of hypocritical and disavowal, so-called white Eurocentric culture. So that my first, or her first, addicted body was that of Emma Bovary, which everyone said, what? Emma Bovary is a big addict? And she shows how Emma Bovary shoots up fictions, hallucinates, even fucks up her suicide attempt because she OD'd with really awful stuff. For Emma Bovary, the library of the pharmacist is the same as where place and site as where she pulls out her drugs. And finally, I think she tries to show how pharmacy has won the drug wars and is a repression of our relation to drugs. Because in this text of Flaubert, Madame Bovary, the pharmacist is the one who survives the drug wars. And he gets all these great medals for civic honor. One of his big projects is to get all DUIs out of the way. So driving under the influence people who drive carriages, he shames them, and so on. So the pharmacist is the legalized pharmaceutical, obviously, cartel that wins out over street drugs in Madame Bovary. So here I was also presenting this to the aristocrats, the Parisian readers, which was a hard game to get away with. And they were, for the most part, most generous and astonished that Madame Bovary, of all possible figures, became the biggest junkie in my list. So I do resist certain, what I saw strategically as ways of dismissing a theoretical inquiry. At the same time, when you're doing drugs, you have to have some inventivity, I think. You see, but you're right, there's a lot of policing here and self-policing. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of drug busts here where I didn't allow myself to go, because this wasn't a joyride or a recreational experiment, or it was I felt I had, in the paranoid days of yore, an ethical, political responsibility to even ask the question, or recycle the Derridian Bataillean question, what do we hold against the drug addict? It's a metaphysical question. What do we hold against? Why do we beat the crap out of them? Why are they being, in the United States of America has the largest penitentiary culture in the world. What's going on? Why are you jailing and criminalizing people who get high? You know, so I had to not look like, a self-involved junkie as I was doing it. So those are restrictions that were also limiting for me. This girl could have no fun while she was here. Thank you. You're very insightful. I saw.
Une sentence from Madame Bovary. C'est la chimère de un cœur romantique que la vie réelle ne satisfait pas. That's
Right.
describes her problem.
Her chronic
The
dissatisfaction.
chimera of a romantic heart that real life doesn't satisfy. But I'm wondering with Madame Bovary if it's a question of sensationalism, addiction for just to feel, or if it's addiction to destroy her senses. And the two are different. One is to destroy desire, and one is to experience all ways of perception of feeling, deepest way of feeling.
We have 2 seconds, but she's also a sex addict. She's the first, she has the first crack baby on the records. The way she rejects her baby and throws up when she has to see the baby and so on. All kinds of stuff is going on there. But what she becomes a carrier of, for me, or the one who wrote this, is destructive jouissance, because she's in a suicidal rush through the stations of the novel that try to contain her.
What motivates that negative jouissance? This negative death drive. I mean, isn't there some drive beyond it for some different form of life that requires the destruction of the psychic structure as it's commonly held?
Nice.
So that underneath it all, there is actually an opening to a possibility that, and that links in with you're talking about the desire for some collective experience. So is there not underneath it all some kind of futile hope for some reconstituted subject in a new collective?
I would ask the expert here whether there's a recuperation to hope for or not from destructive jouissance. But with Flaubert's devastating irony, she even fucks up her suicide. I mean, even that she doesn't get right. So that the destructive jouissance destroys even the romantic fantasy of a glorious fuck you at the end.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's anything for Flaubert. No, I would say he's too ironic and beautifully pessimistic in the skeptical tradition. All he could do was say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. I'm it. I was putting myself to death, and I'm the junkie body. But
I can just say that even when you take drugs alone, the high borders on a kind of crowded feeling. That's why I talked about one's falling back onto what I like to refer to as the group of one, the original infant position. The group of one is body genital, for example. There is not a big difference between the group of one and the group itself. Drugs have a lot to do with the group bond. The group bond gets us away from the responsibilities and pressures of social sexualization, the family, reproduction, future generation. It gets us away from the superego. The superego says, take comfort in future generation, substitute for your losses, live on along this line, at this extended timeline in which you have to accept your finitude. And the ego says, no, don't want to go, won't let go. And that ego, that group of one, is the drug taker.